Kia ora koutou, mihana ke koutou tēnei ata. Thanks for coming and joining us for the Local Context for Researchers webinar. Just want to start off with a karakia. Pauhihiri, paurarama, pau te whakaaro, pau te tangata, pau te aroha. Te pauhiri nei a tātou, mauriora ki a tātou, haumea, hui e, tāki e. So take the chance to welcome everyone for coming along. This is abundant people turning up from all around the globe, from a whole range of places, and it's great that you can come and be here as we talk a little bit more about local context, and we'll actually mostly have other researchers who have been making use of the tools talk about local context and application of notices and labels. So kia ora.
And just echoing Maui, my name's Jane Anderson. I'm one of the founders of Local Context. Again, just thrilled to have so many of you here joining us from all different parts around the world. Want to give a special shout out to Megan Wong, Beth Davis and Rose Barrowcliffe for joining us to share their experiences around the notices. Actually, if you can just go to the next slide for me. So before we begin, we just want to do a land acknowledgement. I'm here in the lands of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in northern New York. We're an organisation based across multiple countries, so our land acknowledgement recognises that the lands that we're on are Indigenous lands, and we pay our respects to the elders, to the ancestors, and to the leaders of these lands and waters. But we do largely a land acknowledgement partly because this is about recognising whose land we're on and what our responsibilities are as guests on these lands. We also do land acknowledgements to recognise the histories and the present day realities of the structural legacies of settler colonialism. So much of our work is focused on Indigenous returns and Indigenous reparations, and so thinking through what land you're on and the responsibilities that you have to the Indigenous communities that you work with and alongside and support as researchers. Next slide. So Local Context began in 2010. This is just a quick, Maui and I are just going to do a really quick summary of the notices and of Local Context, and then move into presentations by Megan, Beth and Rose. But we really began Local Context as an intervention in the around intellectual property and the problems that Indigenous communities were experiencing around intellectual property, thinking very much about how property as a particular tool is one that has served settler interests. In fact, it's created settler worlds, and thinking what kinds of ways can we bring Indigenous cultural authority back into spaces that have been excluded or erased, and deliberately so. So we created the TK labels first, then we recognized that we needed to develop tools for researchers and institutions as well to start doing different kinds of equitable and ethical research, and to actually make sure and to make visible Indigenous rights and interests that sit within research contexts. And then more recently, we've developed the biocultural labels, and I think all of these will be discussed in this seminar as well. We're now a 501(c)(3) not-for-profit. We take very seriously our responsibilities and obligations around Indigenous data sovereignty, and think about what that can mean and what that is for this organisation into the future. So we registered in the Navajo Nation as the site for the rules and the responsibilities that we are held to come out of the Navajo Nation. Next slide, please, Ashley. So this is just give you a sense of our team, both the teams within Local Context, but also the Global Scholars programs that we run through Enrich, the different kinds of outreach, design and development, and governance and leadership that we focus on and deliver back to different communities who utilise our mechanisms and our tools. Next slide, Ashley. So the problems that we really are addressing, and Local Context was designed to focus on, was really emanated from the heritage spaces, thinking about the different kinds of materials that sit within archives, libraries and museums around the world, and that every Indigenous community has those materials within institutions. They may not know where they are, but there's that kind of legacy of the ways in which researchers have documented and recorded Indigenous communities is felt within every institution around the world. That means that the significant information about these collections is largely missing. It was never thought to be important in the first place. And so we tend to have largely impoverished records, and that also affects the ways in which Indigenous communities can find those collections, as well as can reassert control over them. Because of the ways in which the law has operated, in particular, we can kind of talk about copyright law. It really means that Indigenous communities are not the legal rights holders over these collections, and that leads to a lack of control, lack of decision-making, and lack of governance over these collections. But as we all know, there are more researchers working in Indigenous communities than ever before, and many of these research paradigms, both within university context, but also within institutional contexts, have largely not changed. And so that means many of the mistakes that in terms of not properly acknowledging whose land the research is taking place on, who is working with who, what kinds of knowledge and what kinds of knowledge sharing is happening, isn't really taught very well within the academy. And so many of these problems that sit within these archives, libraries and museums are perpetuated in those processes. And then as we move into much more expansive data spaces, that missing metadata largely continues to affect Indigenous capacity to regain control of that information and data. So Maui, I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, so I guess part of the starting point for thinking about some of these things too is emerges from the Indigenous data sovereignty spaces, and thinking about, you know, what are Indigenous data, what sort of rights and interests and places would information need to be recognized as having some connection back to those communities. And so this sort of definition comes from the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, and they talk about data not just being data about us as collectives, nations, or peoples, that sort of traditional knowledge and cultural information that's held in, you know, a variety of places like archives, oral histories, but also data about us as individuals, which might be administrative, legal, health, social, corporate information, or data about our resources and environments. Next slide, please. And so the shift from the challenges of IP, which Jane talked about in the previous slide, and the fact that the ways in which copyright is used or has been used to sort of appropriate knowledge from out of community contexts, and what it means for trying to shift some of their thinking around that. So it's not just an ownership discussion, but you can think about control and it shifting towards cultural authority. And so even the use of Creative Commons licenses requires you to have the copyright in the first place. So it still has the control element sitting with the person that holds the copyright. And so the intervention of the labels to really reaffirm and reestablish the Indigenous cultural authority from their point of view is what comes about through the use of the labels and notices. Next slide. We have a growing community of users with people that are making use of it from across more than 30 countries now, 116 different communities, either active on the hub or in discussions around making use of the labels, over 200 institutions and 150 researchers, and currently around 235 projects. I think the important thing as we sort of talk about these different tools is what are the responsibilities of different parties around this information or data. And we talk about researchers having a responsibility to disclose Indigenous rights and interests in the things that they're collecting and the things that they're sharing and the things that they're curating. And this is because, in part, a lot of the things we're working with are historical collections. And so a number of these either legacy samples or legacy data sets don't have that sort of information in place. And so what can they do to make to sort of raise awareness about that? And that's where the notices come into play. And so we have a series of notices. There's an engagement notice, and so the Open to Collaborate notice is really about just allowing you to inform the community that you're open to collaboration, that you've been engaging with the local context system, and that they would be in a position to make use of labels within your environment. And then the disclosure notices, which are talking about there's some traditional knowledge here, and having the notice in place starts to make space and allow for the labels to be utilized.
So we have 4 notices. We have the traditional knowledge notice and the biocultural notice. And what's important about the notices is you have the icon, but you also have this text that sits alongside it. They're human readable and machine readable. And so what you're looking at here is the human readability of the notices. So the different kinds of the TK notice is really making the functioning as a visible notification that there are rights and responsibilities that might need further attention. Again, this is not assuming that as a researcher, you have the right to be putting labels on collections. It's just a marker that's saying that their Indigenous interests reside and sit here, and they need to be recognised in any other future uses of this material. So we have the traditional knowledge notice and the biocultural notice, and then next slide, Ashley. There's the attribution incomplete and the open to collaborate. As Maui said, the open to collaborate is probably the lowest hanging fruit. It's the one that's just kind of saying this, we have been educated, we know how to start doing this work, we're committed to making different kinds of change, and we're open to doing this in a collaborative way. But the attribution incomplete is often for people who are sitting within institutions, often archivists and librarians who have collections, and they're very familiar with those collections, and they know what's missing. And they know that attribution is not complete, that there's mistakes in the record. And this is a way of kind of making this kind of material visible to Indigenous communities in order to start applying labels and adding that new granular use of the labels. So the parts of the notice, the icon doesn't change, the title doesn't change, and the description doesn't change. You can add an additional use statement, and partly this, we've designed it in this way just to limit confusion, to also make it standardized across the kind of international context in which we're working. Those of you who are familiar with the labels know that communities customize their labels, and that's part of their sovereign right as Indigenous communities to do that. But for researchers and institutions, the notices remain very stable, and that allows them to be recognized in the multiple jurisdictions in which the notices are being utilized. So just a couple of examples, quick ones before we get into the bigger examples that Megan, Beth, and Rose are going to bring to you. This is an example of the Open to Collaborate being utilized within the American Philosophical Society. The American Philosophical Society is, for those of you who are not from what's currently called the United States, holds the largest language materials for Indigenous nations in this country. They had been doing a lot of work of repatriating language materials, but they are in a very colonial building in Philadelphia, and had kind of experienced communities really not knowing how, or whether they should, or whether they could even reach out to them. And so whilst they were already doing some of this work of returning collections and connecting communities back to their language materials, they really decided to use the Open to Collaborate notice to make that differently visible on their website. So they've done that in several places just to kind of help researchers and to help communities know that they're actually doing this work of repatriation and return of collections. The next example is from Simon Fraser University in what's currently British Columbia in Canada. This is one of the most heavily trafficked image archives in the library at the Simon Fraser University. And what's in those photographs are a number, is a very big collection of photographs that do not have proper First Nations names associated with them. And so this was kind of an indicator that the university and the library is starting to do this work of reaching out and collaborating with First Nations in order to kind of update and correct the record and to make sure that those names are there permanently for the future. This is an example from the University of Tasmania in their special and rare collections, again, kind of pointing and making visible the commitment that the university has to collaborating with First Nations in relationship to missing information, missing names, and different kinds of conditions of sharing that communities might have in relationship to using these collections. This is just another example from, I think, the University of Tasmania. Can't see that well today.
Washington State.
Ah, it's Washington State. Okay, you can talk about that.
Really the same thing, and I think the important thing is that it's been utilized in particular places within institutions. So I think, and this is really as people in particular areas make a commitment to work with communities in this way, and sometimes it's based around the collection, sometimes it's in a particular area. And so this, this tour is talking about manuscripts, archives, and special collections. Next slide. Similarly, here's the University of Queensland in the east space, and so they've put in place cultural institution notices here. One that open to collaborate, making the same statement about openness to engaging in new modes of collaboration and engagement, but doing so because they recognize that a lot of the material within the collections, that attribution is incomplete. And so using it here in a kind of a general way to indicate that that's part of what they're inviting communities to do, is to bring more knowledge or correct or update the records which they have around these collections.
This is like the Hudson Museum in Maine, again, doing this work, that kind of first step, and we highly recommend for institutions to start with the Open to Collaborate notice as a means for kind of moving into both changing policies, but also getting deeper and doing that work with the labels and directly with communities. Next slide, Ashley. That's for you, Maui.
So this is at the University of Waikato, the institute I'm a part of, Te Kotai Research Institute. And so when we're thinking about the ways in which we're collaborating with communities around research, we're also open to collaborate with them around application and notices, and they can bring labels onto the material which we generate.
This is an example of a label Open to Collaborate being part of a land acknowledgement, being part of a syllabus that a recent researcher, Andy Rominger, who is part of a larger team that we've been working with, which Beth will talk about shortly. And again, kind of the possibility of utilizing the notices within syllabi themselves offers researchers a different kind of way of kind of making visible the relationships and the responsibilities that sit around using some of the material that might be found in a syllabus. This is an example of a dance company utilizing both the Open to Collaborate notice and the Attribution Incomplete notice. Karen Jameson Dance has a whole archive of dances that draw from First Nations communities, recognizing that and just kind of demonstrating the different kinds of contexts where these notices can be utilized. This is the Welcome Collection in London. This is part of an invitation that the Welcome Collection has initiated in the last year to Indigenous communities to start collaborating, knowing again that they hold very valuable collections to Indigenous communities. And so this kind of work of making them visible, and also a commitment to that conversation, partnership and collaboration that needs to occur.
And this is the use of notices at scale within Manaaki Whenua land care research. And so this is a scientific organisation that holds a series of national collections, and you see there that currently within this database there's just under 700,000 records, and they've put bicultural notices on every single one of those records, and you can see an example here. So under the permissions part within the project permits, they've created a notice for each of the collections, and you'll see there in the project title it talks about the Allen Herbarium. I think it's got somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 records within the herbaria, and each of them have this notice sitting on. And this is an example of the bicultural notice being used alongside gene sequence data. This was data that was put together in relation to the bilberry or the native blueberry from Scandinavia, and it was generated by a New Zealand institution, and then put on this platform GDB, which is all sorts of different kind of berry fruit crop gene sequences. So this is the first example of it being used directly on gene sequence information. And this is really the information of thinking about both how the notice can sit against the place where the data is held, which was the GDB, and then as outputs are generated from that, like papers. In this paper here, you can see how they took the chance to add the bicultural notice just to the picture there on the left-hand side. And also to include a statement in the data availability statement associated with the paper as well.
Great. So we're going to hand it over to Megan Wong from Federation University. And I think what's really exciting now is we get to go deeper about how 3 researchers have gone about utilising the notices, because that's the kind of question that we hear from many people. And so that's partly why we put this webinar together. Megan, would you mind introducing yourself before you begin? And thank you again for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much. You can hear me okay? Yes.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you. Good morning or good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having me, Local Context. I'm a research, as Jane said, I'm a researcher from the eResearch Institute, CERDI at Federation University, Australia. And my research focuses on improving the description of data and making it appropriately reusable, particularly in the areas of soils and agroecology. So today I'm presenting from, first of all, I should have said sorry, I'm presenting from Dja Dja country here in central Victoria, Australia. And I'd really like to thank Dja very much for the privilege of being able to work with them on the data management side of this project. And the project I'm presenting today is Jandak Dja Country Healing Home, and it's a Dja-led and conceived project. So next, thank you. Oh, sorry, there you go. There's the project. I'd like to thank the project partners. Dylan Mail is at the University of Melbourne, and he's been leading the agronomy side of the project, whereas myself, Cass Price, and some guiding wisdom and patience from Maui and Steph along the way in the areas of Indigenous data governance and data governance. So I'd like to stress that this project is Dja-led. So thank you. Next slide. So just a little bit about the project. It focuses on kangaroo grass, which is a plant that is really culturally significant to Djaron country. Thank you. So in the words of proud Djara man, Rodney Carter, I'll just quote him, kangaroo grass across altered landscapes is a massive positive for Djara as a people to see, to visualise the colours, and then to use farming systems to make that efficient and commercially viable for the people to enjoy the product itself for cultural reasons. This is really important. So the data generated through this research has two components. So firstly, there were trials conducted as part of Dylan's PhD, and this included data from a number of trials in the glasshouse and the field, using different seed of different provenance across country, and doing trials on herbicide resistance, sowing time, etc., to inform the production of a high value crop for niche markets and returning plants to country, to care for country. So the format of the data generated is data sets in CSV, Excel, but there's also other data products such as peer-reviewed publications and presentations that are emerging. So next slide, thank you. So another aspect of the research was investigating Djara's rights, responsibilities and priorities for kangaroo grass on country, and how this might inform data solutions or solutions, and how areas that can be progressed to support Djara's Indigenous data governance for kangaroo grass. So part of this research included the scoping of BC and TK labels that could be used to support Djara priorities for discovery and reuse of kangaroo grass data or information. So what we did was we interviewed Djara as well as researchers. The questions were co-developed with Djara. So we interviewed around rights and responsibilities and priorities in terms of the challenges, and some challenges for data discovery, access and reuse now into the future. So this work itself generated data products such as interview data, presentations, reports, and some information, some supporting material for Djara to take this forward. Next slide, thanks. So it became clear looking at together at the BC and TK labels that it's they really did have the potential to support the policies and guidelines of Djara should they wish to implement, such as the research agreement around expressing the ICIP rights of Djara, that the data is correctly attributed and there was consent to release, and they have the potential to support the Djara cultural integrity guidelines, which state the need to label data appropriately as defined by Djara under, and also in the under the research ethics that this research is conducted under. Us researchers have an obligation to consult with Djara around how data is securely deposited and access arrangements around that data. So yeah, thank you. So I'd like to say Djara became really interested after seeing some initial presentations and some in-action examples and how it could support the priorities. So they got really interested in BCTK labels, and similarly, us researchers were interested in learning more. So this is just some things that really have helped us move along in the early stages. So talking, access to experts, local context hub there to support us, which is great. Having some dedicated Indigenous data funding has been very helpful, and also having an understanding supportive project manager, strategic planners within Djara as an organisation, and leaders and emerging leaders with cultural authority getting interested, excited behind this will be great in taking, critical in taking this forward. developing labels forward as JARA see fit. So next slide, thanks. So what the researchers have done is we've starting to register our data sets, papers, and reports associated with the project with local context. And what we've done is we've assigned biocultural notices, and we've notified Djadjarung that these products exist. They have biocultural notices on them should they wish to develop the labels further, and those labels will travel alongside the data products. Next slide, thank you. So through the interviews that we conducted and a bit of an analysis, we identified some labels that were potentially fit for purpose for JARA to develop further should they wish, to convey their rights, responsibilities and priorities for kangaroo grass and kangaroo grass enterprise going forward and healing country. So the first was the consent verified to support conveying that this research is done under the ICIP through research agreement between the parties. The next one was the provenance to help express JARA's significant relationship and responsibility to kangaroo grass on country. And the third was that multiple communities label, because recognising that kangaroo grass is widespread. And JARA are very keen on ensuring that mobs on their country, if this data is reused on that country, that it's reused in an appropriate way to support their aspirations on their country for kangaroo, their own countries for kangaroo grass. Next slide, thank you. So very strong themes coming through from the interview were the importance of the appropriate engagement of potential new research partnerships and enterprises, and development opportunities with JARA that are ethically just and have equitable benefits, and that is as defined by JARA. So this is where the BC open to collaboration and the BC open to commercialisation would be of interest. And another theme that came through was that JARA may also wish to express when and where the data should be interpreted with season. Next slide, thank you. So some future challenges for JARA. Now they're working out how to best customise and apply the labels within their own current governance systems and project management structures. So if adopted, they recognise that there's places that they could write the labels potentially into policy and processes to encourage researchers to uptake the labels, such as writing them through the research agreements, for example, something like that. And we're beginning with JARA to investigate repositories that will support the label. We found that a little bit of a challenge so far, but really positive feedback from repositories being open to where they might apply the labels within their repositories, and researchers are continuing to apply, in the meantime, apply the notices, particularly that in this case, the BC notices to anything that's produced as we go. And next slide, thank you. So this is very bright and dotty, but just wanted to say basically our learnings as researchers would be just that, well, we're really excited, and partners are really excited to take this forward. That what you can do is just get in there, get into local context. They've been really supportive. Register your data sets and your data products, and just get the conversations going with your institutes, repositories, journals, and so yeah, it's I would say have the conversations early and reach out for any support you might need, and be brave, I guess, and be patient, because you'll find that there'll be lots of truths that haven't been spoken, changes in institutes will be needing to face changes and address issues which they haven't before, which Jane and Maui covered so nicely in the opening, and that the conversations need to be, the cultural safety with the Indigenous peoples you're engaging with is really paramount. So yeah, with that said, it's exciting times. I think we're all on a journey together. So yeah, we look forward to it continuing and all of you getting out there. And thank you, Local Context.
Amazing, Megan. Thank you so much, and especially for being so early over there in Australia, and just all the work that you've been doing with JARA, and how I think many lessons in relationship to Indigenous directed research, as well as kind of the support and how the notices really do, as you kind of finish, start that conversation and start a conversation that is critical to the future lives, not only of that material, but also for Indigenous futures. So thank you again, Megan. I'm going to hand it to Beth Davis from the University of Maine. Beth, again, thank you so much for joining us. If you can also just introduce yourself, and then I know you're going to tell us a lot about the work that you've been doing in Wabanaki lands in Maine. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jane. So I'm Beth. I'm a PhD student at the University of Maine. Next slide, please. And I've had the great privilege and pleasure of working with Local Context in kind of two different capacities. First and foremost, on a kind of organizational level, working as part of the Maine-eDNA grant, where I've been part of the group that helped to introduce Local Context and adopt the Open to Collaborate notice, as well as the Local Context API into our workflow. And as well as a student researcher in the Eco-Informatics lab, where I work on using environmental DNA for river biomonitoring and restoration issues. And so I'll be going briefly over both of these projects and kind of the differences and issues that I've seen along the way from both perspectives. And I also want to note that in both projects, we primarily use the biocultural labels and notices, since we're collecting mostly genetic and environmental metadata. Next, please. So first, I want to really emphasize that nothing happens in a vacuum and nothing happens alone. So these are both very collaborative projects, and there's so many thanks that have to go out to everyone on this list and more as the work continues evolving. So first, thank you so much to Local Context, both for having this webinar and for all of the support that you've given us over the last couple of years. Thanks to the Wabanaki Tribal Historic Preservation Officers and the members of Penobscot Indian Nation Department of Natural Resources that I've been working with. And then from Maine-eDNA, we've had a really great group of faculty, staff, and students that have been and continue to put so much of themselves into this work and commit to ethical research. Next. So very briefly to introduce Maine-eDNA. Maine-eDNA is a cross-institutional grant. It's going on its 4th year into its 5th and final. And the aim of Maine-eDNA is to use environmental DNA, which is a non-invasive sampling method that takes DNA and genetic material from the environment, like from a water sample. And by extracting it, we can detect species and draw other conclusions and information from the environment. And this information can be used for fisheries management, restoration, invasive species management, and more. And while there are more people on the grant than I could mention in the next 12 minutes, the grant itself also has a project. And so this is called the Maine-eDNA index sites, and those are what those dots on the map are. So these index sites are arranged all along the coast of what is now Maine to collect geospatial and temporal information of coastlines, lakes, and streams along different watersheds in, again, what is now Maine. And because this encompasses such a wide area and time scale, we use this app called Survey123, which is basically a mobile-based app hosted by Esri, it's just a GIS provider. And what Survey123 allows us to do is whenever a sampler goes into the field, we can just work through a series of questions and drop-down forms to input the metadata about where we are and when we are right there in the field. So from the very moment of sampling, there's a strong and continuous data record that is associated with that sample through a barcode system, which I'll get into more later, all the way through our database. And so the last thing I'll touch on in this slide is This map was put together by Dr. Dan Ranko and Dr. Andy Rominger, and they were able to plot the locations of those index sites onto a map of traditional Wabanaki territory. And so the Wabanaki nations are the Maliseet, Micmac, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy peoples, and I'm presenting from their homelands right now. And so, as you can see, these index sites and all the other work that we do in Maine-eDNA is within traditional Wabanaki territory. So everything that we do and all the information we collect is very bioculturally relevant. Next slide, please. And so when we started working with local contexts, one of the biggest problems we had was trying to figure out how to integrate this community Indigenous-based metadata into a workflow that really wasn't designed with it in mind at the beginning. And so Maine-eDNA had made a database system for environmental and genetic information, and we had to figure out where to put the biocultural labels and information in that would be preserved throughout the sampling process. And luckily, we already have this sort of 1, 2, 3 tools. So what we ended up doing was first and foremost putting on a land acknowledgement so that when someone goes to take a sample and they open the app, they can immediately be reminded and have put in context where they are in the communities that are involved in the information that they're going to collect. Next, please. And from that sort of 1, 2, 3 entry, by linking a local context project with all the bicultural information and contact information, from the very moment that sample is collected, we can then use that exact same pipeline that had already been created to connect the Indigenous and biocultural metadata through the freezer archive, the barcode system, which is placed on sample tubes, and then that can go throughout the entire database, which will then go to repositories and published products. And so this gave us a fairly, I won't say quick and easy because it wasn't, but it ended up being a fairly efficient way of adding on this metadata field that we really hadn't designed from the beginning. Next, please. Like I said, this wasn't quick or easy. So this is built on decades of work. And one great milestone happened in 2018 when the University of Maine signed a memorandum of understanding with the Penobscot Nation. And what this did was mostly a commitment to ethical research and some guidelines for how to handle physical artifacts and samples. And so by the time Maine-eDNA came around, there was enough momentum to really push for continuing that work and continuing that commitment. And so by July 2021, there was enough popular demand in the grants to host an ethics workshop. And then the following fall, we were introduced to local context by way of a fall team science course, which is where we started to try and figure, okay, we have this commitment and this energy, but what we can actually do with it. And so that's when we started trying to figure out where we could go in the workflow and in the database. And so by the next January in 2022, we were to begin integration trials with the Maine-eDNA database. Next. And then by February, we were able to kind of finish with the rough draft, so to speak, and work on refining the process and producing tools and training materials to try and make onboarding easier for new hires and new students. And we also worked with those TIPOs, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, to understand better about what the tribes actually needed and wanted in terms of communication load and how to organize the different samples of this giant project. And then it's final on this slide, but there's still much more work to be done. But in April 2022, we were able to officially adopt the Open to Collaborate notice and have integration of the local context API with the Maine-eDNA database officially. And so from now, we're working on encouraging more researchers to get their own projects on the hub, continue committing to ethical research and kind of going beyond that, that minimum step, as Jane was saying. Next, please. So deviating from the organizational side, I want to talk briefly about my experience as a student. I also want to affirm that I can't speak from anyone's experience but my own. And so when I came on to the grant in Maine-eDNA, I began talking with the Penobscot Indian Nation Department of Natural Resources in fall 2021, which is about the same time that we met local contexts. And at the time, we were interested in trying to see like where eDNA, what can this be used for in a useful way for the community? And the Penobscot Nation, they do a lot of their own water quality and water sampling. And one protocol that they use for this is biomonitoring, which follows the EPA model of monitoring for benthic macroinvertebrates. And so through a lot of trial and error, we landed on eventually this question of how does eDNA compare to water quality metrics that are currently being used? So can we use eDNA? Is it more efficient or less efficient than their current method of sampling? Could it save them some money, save them some time? And where the notes come into place, so that picture, that little blue and yellow round thing, that's an eDNA sample. I actually filtered that last week. And in that sample, there probably is a fair amount of mud and silt, but there's also genetic information. And that can contain both the kind of desired or of interest species of those sensitive benthic macroinvertebrates and maybe some fish. And that is definitively bioculturally sensitive and bioculturally relevant material. But there's also DNA of really any other species or organism that had the DNA in the stream when it was collected. And even though we weren't searching for it, it is still of biocultural interest. And the NOS provide a framework to discuss that and to talk about how the incidental collection may change data privacy or data sharing concerns. Next, please. And so this is kind of my, from my experience as a researcher of the scientific method, where you still have like going through hypotheses and communication and sampling and your reports, but it's always hinging around those oops moments for where you have to go back to the drawing board and try to figure out where you can go from there. And these oops moments can be like it rained and maybe you lost a sampler, or turns out you can't actually do what you thought you could with the method. And while these are fairly known in field ecology, in my experience, when it comes to especially community work, having that time to reiterate is extremely crucial, because you're not only trying to work on trying to figure out like what else in the science you can do and how to adjust your plans, but also trying to communicate, consult with people, to confer about those data privacy or data sharing concerns, how the NOS may be impacted, how the labels may be impacted. And next, please. So one of the big pitfalls that was really highlighted when working with this as a student versus at the organizational level is, this is an actual quote that I got when I was looking for advice from a different researcher about how the dissertation timeline when you're a student, when you're in a grad program, is very not conducive to community work oftentimes, because the deadlines and pressure to get things out at certain milestones in a certain sequence often doesn't leave very much room to really build a relationship or trust with the community, especially if you're a new student or new to an area. Next, please. And so while from both perspectives, the organizational and as just myself as a student researcher, there have been very clear benefits of the NOS providing a good framework for interacting with communities and how to set and communicate expectations, and preserving that community metadata and the contact information for who to go to. And as I said, like contextualizing like where you are instead of just focusing on the data itself. The issues that have come up have also been fairly consistent of, again, both that the pacing of student milestones and requirements being difficult for a new researcher to get into this field and this practice of community work. But also at the organizational level, it's very clear how in some cases the burden of training and coordinating this work is placed on very few people, and often the same people over and over again. And so one thing to improve on and that we're trying to do in Maine-eDNA is producing more materials and resources so that more of us can take on that burden of training and onboarding, and to kind of open up the door as much as we can to make it easier. And as well, with that, we're all excited by community collaborations. It can be very novel, very exciting, but there needs to be enough time, again, for reiteration and to follow through to build those relationships. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. That was really great, and I think people can see from that also some of the kind of changes that happen when you start to have to think about how things start being embedded in workflows for projects as well. There's a really great example there. So I'm just want to hand over to Rose Barrowcliffe, who is one of the Enriched Global Fellows, but has been also working with us on this. So I'll hand it to you, Rose, to introduce yourself and do your part of the presentation.
Thanks, Maui. So my name is Rose Barrowcliffe. I am Butchulla of the Wannamata clan. I'm coming to you today from Gubbi Gubbi country, which is known as the Sunshine Coast at the moment in Australia. I am a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University. And I'm also the First Nations Archives Advisor to Queensland State Archives. So I kind of bounce between these two roles of working within a collecting institution, but in my research role, my research is about representation of Indigenous people in archives. So not just in record content, but in every aspect of an archive. So decision-making, employment, metadata, everything. So that's kind of how I came to connect with local context through my work and research. Next slide, please. So while I was at the archives one day, I was invited to go to a cultural awareness training, as we call it here in Australia. And I was listening to the trainer, who was a woman by the name of Leanne Wilson, who's Bidjara. And she was explaining how we need to, when we look at any historical artifact or any record, we need to consider it from two perspectives, at least two perspectives. And one is of the perspective of the Indigenous people of that country, and the other is of the colonizer. This is in colonized nations, obviously. So we're looking at colonial records. We need to consider that there's always at least two stories. And the story of the Indigenous people is represented by the green ribbon, and the story of the colonists is represented by a blue ribbon. So she calls it the green ribbon and blue ribbon stories. And she came up with this conceptual framework based on a story that has been passed down through her family history and connected to their country. So as I was listening to this, I was so excited, because this is what we call in archival practice or in archival theory, parallel provenance or societal provenance, or multiple provenances to a record. But this is the first time I'd heard an Indigenous conceptual framework for this. So I got all excited, and I wanted to use this conceptual framework in my research, but it's not written down anywhere. It's not recorded anywhere. Leanne uses it in her training, but that's it. So I reached out to Leanne and asked if she would consider publishing it, because I was very aware. I wanted to make sure it was attributed to her, and I was thinking in a very academic way that I could cite her. So we decided to co-author the Green Ribbon and Blue Ribbon Stories article. Next slide, please. So because of the work I do in archives, I'm very aware of orphan works and the lack of attribution that Jane was referring to earlier. I see that so much in my day-to-day work. And then also as an academic, being aware of the publication process and copyright and how that affects or it sets up a situation where the traditional owners of the knowledge lose any control over that knowledge when it becomes published in an academic journal article. And they're not mentioned as, or they're not listed as the authors. So, you know, a traditional publication process might have been me interviewing Leanne and she being a participant in a research project or an interviewee. And then I, as the person who wrote the article and published the article, become the author, maybe the sole author on that article, or or, you know, I might mention her in that, but, or at best she would be a co-author. But there was still a problem with that process, because the knowledge, the whole reason I wanted to write this article was because it was a Bidjara piece of knowledge, this conceptual framework. And I didn't want to be seen in any way, shape or form to be claiming any ownership over this conceptual framework. As far as I'm concerned, that's Bidjara. I didn't want it to be confused with, through citation, being me claiming any ownership over that. Next slide, please. So what we did was, Leanne and I, we co-authored the article through a yarning process, where, you know, we met several times and over Zoom, and then I did the writing, and then we put together the article through this iterative process of sending it back to her, talking about it again. Did it align with how she wanted the conceptual framework represented? Did she feel like herself and her family were being represented fairly within the article? And then we also took the step of making sure Leanne was the primary author on the article. And then if you're citing specifically that the blue ribbon or green ribbon story conceptual framework, we've got a different citation recommendation there for her within the article, the broader citation. So there's still one other issue that hadn't been addressed in that process, and that is that Leanne is only one person, one Bidjara person, or one person within her family, and she was sharing this knowledge as one person. We were two individuals working together. We hadn't spoken with the Bidjara community about this. She's a leader in her family, so she felt confident she could share it, but still, we didn't, initially we thought, we'll put a TK label on it, great. But the Bidjara community don't have labels developed, and we hadn't been having those conversations with them. So I was lucky enough to go to the local context training in Aotearoa in February of this year, and I raised it with Jane, Maui and Jeanette at that training, and they suggested that we could put a TK notice on the journal article. Next slide, please. So we, again, this was another process, another round of conversations to go through, because actually a TK notice had never been applied to an academic journal article before. And I was lucky enough, or actually had proactively chosen the journal to publish this article in, because I knew that the editor would be open to this level of attribution, and even in future to including labels where possible. So we had these ongoing conversations between myself, the editor of the Archives and Manuscript Journal, and we also had the local context team sitting in on those meetings, talking about how we could apply and where we could add the TK notice into the journal article. And so just to be clear, the reason why we use the TK notice is because even though we had given Leanne primary authorship over the journal, so she has copyright ownership, we still wanted to make it clear that the knowledge within the article belonged to more than just the copyright owners. So that was really important to both of us to make that clear. So that's why we wanted to use the TK notice. So the article is now published. I will drop the link in the chat for everyone if they want to go look at it online and see it. It's a bit hard to show where the format of all of it on one slide. But the TK notice is there now, which is really exciting that we got that out. It was a huge collaborative process. And I will say, you know, Beth talked about how, you know, this thing about committing to the process even after the initial research or the initial project is finished. And I think that's really important. And one of the things that has come out of this journal article is that the Charles Sturt University, which is one of the primary universities in Australia that teaches archival practice or gives certification for archivists, has invited us now to come and speak about this process of knowledge attribution and how we came to be co-authoring the journal article and the process for that. And because I'm the academic, I was listed as the primary author for that, or the primary contact, sorry, for the journal article. So Charles Sturt reached out to me. But of course, the first thing that I've done is making sure Leanne has that opportunity as well to be involved in that, which I'm pleased to say will be delivering to both undergraduate and postgraduate students doing any sort of LIS coursework at Charles Sturt in about a few weeks' time, to talk about how important and how considered this process of knowledge attribution is, both within an academic framework, but also within archives. So I think that's it from me.
Kia ora, Rose. Thank you. Jeanette Hamilton-Pierce here. We're going to go into questions from everyone. If you want to put them into the chat, or if you're wanting to get onto screen. We might stop the slides for now. Thanks, Ashley. In the chat, can you please put a word about what you've heard so far, a word of how you feel about the presentations right now? What's that word that's coming up for you? Would anybody like to put their words up in the chat? What's a word? Amazing, collaboration, I love it. Excited, of course it's exciting. It's so inspirational to hear all this beautiful work going on out there. Thank you all for being here too. Progress. We could unwrap that for the next 3 days, couldn't we? Or just go on, progress from where we've been to where we're going. Absolutely, it's all happening right here. Thanks for that word, Miria. Pride, that's a wonderful word. I love that word. Brilliant. So we're going to go into some questions. You heard some tips come up as well. I just want to go to each of them first of all while your questions are coming through. We're going to ask you your questions. There were some questions that came up through your registration as well, and we could hopefully get into those questions. But I just want to get a couple of words, a sentence from Megan and Beth and Rose. Megan, how did you feel about what is the one tip you would like them to go from this presentation of yours?
There's lots, but I'd say get in there early and give it a go, and contact local context, because we have learned, like, we're fitting a label on, for example, a journal article in retrospect, where you've popped the labels on, that gets the conversation going. So early.
Love it. We're going to be putting in our support at localcontext.org as the email to use. Beth, what's your one tip?
Don't wait for the perfect person to contact you with a community. You're going to be awkward. It's okay. Just reach out, be awkward, and let it go from there.
Love it, Beth. Love it. Let's get on with those conversations earlier rather than later. Get on with the conversations now. There's no perfect person. You're the perfect person. You be the perfect person. Go straight in there and let's start doing this. Rose, you're ahead of the times in these publications. Go for it, Rose. What's your tip?
So mine is just, you've already said it, Jeanette, is conversations. Keep the conversations going. There were many times in that process of doing that journal article, like when I found out we shouldn't be using a TK label, I was so discouraged for a minute. I was like, oh no, I've said we can do this and now we can't. But I explained it to Leanne, she was fine. We met with the editor, we went back and forth, and it was just a lot of conversations. And as long as you're keeping those communication channels open, I think you're moving in the right direction.
Exactly. The point is here, relationships, building relationships is so much more important. Put your hand up, raise your hand. You've got a question, you want to ask a question, in the chat. And if there's any questions coming up, has anybody got any questions that would love to write down to your heart right now, or just dying to ask ask these wonderful ladies? What's that question? What would that question be? Landon, would you just like to come on, raise your hand, ask your question, or your excitement? Your excitement. I'd like to hear your excitement too. Go for it. Is that all right, Landon?
Oh yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, no, I was just it wasn't really a question, but like my supervisor and I that I'm working at the research lab, we're pretty excited to be using the Open to Collaborate label on one of the projects that we're working on currently.
Awesome. Charles, would you like to just come on, Charles, and just say what you've written?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you, Charles.
Yeah, just Beth's point about the academic timeframe and expectations from the academy not lining up with the time that it takes to actually build relationships really resonated with me. I'm an anthropology PhD, so I wanted to make sure to take the time to do things slowly and properly. And of course, that means sort of a lot of limbo on the academic end of things. But frankly, I don't feel that my primary responsibility is to the academy. It's to the people I'm trying to work with. So yeah, it's always encouraging to hear that others have had similar struggles. And then I think what I enjoyed hearing most today was from Rose about working with Leanne to help her get something published. I feel like there's a lot of incredible knowledge that is it sort of doesn't get to the wide audience it deserves, because not everybody is trained and experienced in the very sort of narrow language and way of writing that academic or other scientific publication requires. And I've been finding that editing and collaborating with people on that type of thing is actually something that I find more gratifying than doing the primary research itself. So I'm hoping to find a way to maybe turn that into my role to help people in the way that that Rose was able to collaborate with Leanne. That was a really cool story. So thank you.
Charles, that's awesome. Thank you for outlining that.
Can I just yeah, look, I just want just sort of adding on to that, you know, there's a whole range of different ways that the kind of relationships you're having with communities can be, I guess, represented. You know, in some places, you know, this sort of the sort of acknowledgement of that community can be sort of something that's explicit, whether it's a land acknowledgement or something else. And the sort of use of the labels that reflect the sort of attribution that can happen in a more kind of formal way. But then, you know, the sort of the extra step that Rose did with making sure that they were included as authors and part of the authorship of it, and all of these things, you know, really helping the community then be involved in discussions around access to, and you saw that with sort of Megan's talk and the sort of work which they're doing around thinking about how the ongoing data governance comes about. So, you know, it's it's just been really, you know, I think there's a couple of things that have been really nice when I sort of reflect on the examples, is people have got on and started working and having those conversations with the community. But even though it's often taken a bit of while to come about, the changes that they've made make it then easier for the next, either the next project, the next people, the next community. And I think that's the thing that's been really encouraging when you see some of the examples that people have put forward.
Can I just add to that as well? I'll say, Charles, with the publication process, you know, I think there's a lot of agency for individual researchers in that process. Like, you don't have to wait for permission from the academy to have community members as co-authors on a publication. And the other thing I will say is there's already journals out there that are excited about this work and will be open to doing it. And the more working with those journals first sort of is changing the tide of how publication works. So I've already had another editorial board sort of get in touch and say, oh, that's really interesting how you've done that in that paper. We'd be interested in understanding how maybe that could work with our journal as well. So it's like we can drive change at an individual level as researchers.
Nice, thank you. Jessica, would you like to talk to your comment?
So sorry. I'm sorry, I'm cooking dinner right now, so I can't easily navigate my computer, but I've really enjoyed listening to the presentations while I do cook. And I just want to say that I'm here at the University of Oklahoma and work in affiliation with the Center for the Ethics of Indigenous Genomic Research. And we've had these conversations about the work that Local Context is doing now for some time, and thinking about how we can move forward in this direction and what makes sense, what works best for the various tribal partners with whom we're collaborating. And so I'm really excited about the potential, and we'll definitely be in touch.
Awesome, thank you. Has anybody got any replies for Jessica?
Sorry, come again?
I was just seeing if anybody wanted to talk to.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. I think one of the things is kind of that transition from interest into getting things going is sort of kind of picking the right sort of like the right starting point. There's obviously some projects are a little bit more complicated and trickier in terms of the different relationships that are involved than other ones, and getting something going with something that's a little bit small and discreet is often a good place to start. There are ways of dealing with some of the bigger projects, and seeing that with the Manaaki Whenua example, but that often just requires a little bit of talking about. And I think what we're hoping is that over time, as people are seeing this sort of different examples around how they've been applied and how the sort of projects have been kind of framed and shaped, is that will provide guidance to other groups as well.
Thanks. Joseph, what's your question, Joseph?
So I know Local Context has done a lot of work, and by that I mean lots of interpersonal legwork, working with the sort of decision makers and institutes that make these rules. So I just threw in the chat a couple of articles about IRBs and how they're really badly trained and they're really far behind here in the United States. And then also one about big data that's collapsing all of these different data sets with different rules. Like here in the States, the FDA, which is clinical trials, has one set of rules. The NIH, which is basic applied research, has the common rule governing it, which is not a law. And then CDC has public health law to support it. And then sort of like epidemiological information that they get from medical records is under HIPAA. So we have all these different data sets, different rules, and IRBs are not able to handle the big data environment. So my question is has Local Context made any headway with these institutional review boards and other sort of decision-making bodies for different data, whether it's here you had examples of cultural and linguistic data, but the other thing that's on the chopping block here is data from LIDAR, the ground penetrating radar, which doesn't require consent. So there's all of these different data sets, and the people who approve them at the university level don't understand. And this is just another layer that they might not understand.
Joseph, you always ask the big questions. There's probably a couple of things. So one is, I think, what are the things that are creating some momentum towards change? I think in part as people have been thinking a little bit more about sort of open data and responsibilities around it, the sort of standards associated with that, particularly in terms of the care principles now being thought about a little bit more. That's creating some pressure. The pressure is not so much at the IRB level as much as it is at sort of, I think, sort of department level. So some of the policy documents are starting to kind of reference both fair and care and things, and that sort of creates a little bit of a cascade, sort of a cascade down. There's, I think, some of that, there's obviously some of that kind of international things that are going on, people talking about digital sequence information and benefit sharing around that, which also creates a different sort of pressure for or interest around how the labels are expressing provenance information. And that could be applied to other sorts of data sets. The Manaki Whenua example is not genetic information. It's kind of herbaria, and there's a few institutions that are looking at its sort of application in that space. There's no reason why it couldn't be used in the context of kind of LiDAR data as well. In some ways, I think this is probably one of the, I guess, tensions around its application is when it's used as a mechanism to deal with legacy records, and so there hasn't been appropriate consultation in place, and it sort of becomes a post collection exercise versus something that's supporting a project which has had consultation in place. And with you talk about those examples of there's still research that's happening in now and into the future that should have consultation but doesn't, and then applying this as the, I guess, sort of the easy way out after the fact is, I guess, something that's a challenge to deal with as well. But I think it'll be sort of kind of the policy areas, there's a few funders now that are sort of saying that labels should be put in place if people are doing things with traditional knowledge. But I think as it becomes, I guess, a more integrated, as intervention becomes more integrated into the whole ecosystem, so more publications, ORCID in places, and data repositories that can, sort of apply the notices and labels, and we can kind of work out some different sorts of standards around it. Then I think, you'll probably see it dropping down into the IRBs as well.
All right, follow up. And this might be for Jane. So for people who don't know, when I say collapsing, I mean collapsing towards the human, because a lot of times Indigenous people see this research on this or that data set solely for the protection of that kind of data. But right now, because commercial interests want to collapse everything towards the human and how it could serve the human, a lot of these data sets are proxy data for the human. And in terms of the label and how you construct the rules around the label and the use of the data that the label's attached to, you could possibly put something in there like this data is not amenable to machine learning or any kind of technology that's going to collapse it into a proxy data set for the human, something like that. I don't know if you guys have considered that or not.
May not be. So a couple of things. I think there's collapsing into or sort of aggregating up into kind of larger data sets, and what does that mean for the labels? I think there's a conversation that we're starting to think about in relation to that, and how it would be represented when you've got multiple communities labels represented within an aggregated data set, and how that can then be represented. I think that other way of collapsing, the collapsing down part, I'm not quite sure. I think, one of the things we say is that the notices and labels don't are useful in some places, but they're not going to be useful in every place. And it's probably, to get the sorts of controls in place that Indigenous communities are looking like, or Indigenous peoples are looking like, there's probably going to be around using a variety of tools. And some of those will be copyright and intellectual property tools, and the labels will have its place, but there'll also have to be other things done as well. And I think just need to be as intentional about the way we use different tools for different purposes.
Right, can we just carry on? We've just got a couple of more minutes to go for the questions. Beth, I don't think Gina is here. Gina is here. Gina, are you here for your question? Beth, your answer to Gina's question, are you just able to outline that? Oh, Gina, would you just like to briefly discuss what your question is, and Beth to answer?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm new to the labels, but I've been curious for some time, and it's really about the technology that allows the labels and the notices to sort of come with that, the way it functions. So the question is, does it generate a prompt when people access the information? So you apply the label onto data that you publish online. Yeah, I'm generally just curious, and I'm sorry if the question is too obvious.
No, you're all good. So I think, so for how Maine-eDNA has the database set up, there's the database itself, which has the API connection to local context. So whenever there's an update to the label on the local context hub, that change is reflected, it gets pinged back and forth so that the change on the hub is reflected in the change of the database. And so for any change on the database, whether it's coming from the hub or it's direct in the database, if you want a downstream ping to a different repository or a different site or service, if it doesn't have an API hook, it's not automatic, is my understanding. So you'd have to set that up or do it manually. So you could set up to give a notification to you. So like, hey, there's been an update. You now need to go in and change, like update this information on the repository, or like send a message to like the journal, update like the metadata involved. So that's my understanding.
There's kind of two key places where it's relevant. One is in setting up a project, so you can apply a notice, you get a unique identifier, and that allows some sort of space for the community to make their decisions about what labels they might apply. And that will depend, if they're already on the hub, then it can have a sort of an automatic notification to themselves on their page. And then if they're not on the hub, it can be an invite to them to join. And so the processes which they'll go to will take a little bit longer, but when they decide to do that and decide what labels they think are best suited for it, that happens, it just automatically update. And that's what we did with Whakatohia, working with the Manaaki Whenua site. They just put the project through that related to our territory, and we applied the labels, and the next day it was sitting on 1,200 records.
Thanks, Maui. We are going to go through and do implementation at another time. That's and the scoping of a project, how it's implemented, the API following this is around notices. I'm just going to say, Natasha, are you okay with the answer that you got from Corey?
Yes, that was super helpful. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. We're just going to have the last question from Candy. Candy, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, yes. Kia ora, everyone from Aotearoa. Thank you so much, Local Context, for this movement, and to our presenters today. I'm an industry supervisor for a PhD student at Auckland University of Technology, and our mission is to create artificial intelligence to identify audio visual content to make it easier to search, retrieve, and effectively control Indigenous content, how it is used. And so I did have a lot of questions, but now it's actually been answered. It's really just continuing the conversations with AUT, Auckland University of Technology. So far, we have the Computer Science Department is very keen to join Local Context, and I've introduced them to the Maori faculty. So just waiting for that relationship to start building and to hopefully encourage the Vice Chancellor of AUT to join Local Context. What I'm wanting to do is to make sure that we do use the local context notices in our research, and eventually it is to make sure that we engage with our tribes to actually label the training sets. So not just the video content, but the training sets itself. So it has been a little bit of I just had to make sure that I was being able to catch, make sure that Indigenous rights have been captured in this work. So it's great to have. We've never had the Computer Science Department and the Māori Department working together. So this is a new relationship. So just thank you so much to Local Context for putting these tools for us. I don't have a question anymore. I mean, if anyone's got more advice, but I don't have any more questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Candy. We are going to move on. Thanks for that update too, Candy. Really appreciate it. We are going to move on. Can you just put the slides up? Thank you, dear Ashley. Awesome. I'm going to put these two links in to go to register on the Hub and create a researcher account, apply an open to collaborate notice on your research website, project or data, and go to the researcher survey. Tell us about your research, anything you want to hear from us. Please either go into the survey. Like I said before, the Hub demo and the scoping of a project, getting to the implementation, to the API, all that technical stuff we all love. We are going to go into that next. I'm going to hand it over to Corey, who's going to give us really what's happening.
Yeah, thanks, Jeanette. Hi, everyone. Corey Rowe, Outreach Manager, Local Context. Ashley, if you could go to the next one. Thank you. Just wanted to briefly mention that we are hiring. We have more information on our website. We are also planning on a summit in Aotearoa, which we're very excited about. We have a newsletter. If you're not already subscribed, do so in the footer of our website to hear more about this. But just want to keep everybody up to date on those things. And I think we'll hand it over to Rose to close us out.
And we do want to thank Rose, Megan and Beth again. Give them a big, huge love and send all the love to them. Thank you so much to the 3 years. It was amazing. Yes, hand it over to Rose. Kia ora, Rose.
Kia ora, Jeanette. Thank you so much for that, and to Corey. So I guess I just wanted some of the points that listening to Megan and Beth's presentations that really stood out to me was, and I can certainly concur with this, is the amount of support that Local Context give. So if in doubt, just reach out to the team. They're amazing and available across all time zones. So yeah, just if you have any questions, just ask. And I forget if it was Megan or Beth now said, be brave and be patient. And I think that's really valuable advice. It does take time, but you're building relationships through this process. And so it's much bigger than a single research project. And those conversations that have to happen are really important parts of the process. So yeah, don't necessarily rush them, just enjoy that process as it unfolds, I would say. And then also just that there are different ways to start this process. As you've seen today, whether it's from an institutional side, whether you're a researcher in an institution working as an individual or representative of a researching body, there's different ways to start, but just start, I would say. And I guess as someone who works in archives, for me, this is a real passion project because I see so many orphan works and I see so many collections locked up because there's not correct attribution on those collections and on that knowledge. So I think we have a real responsibility as researchers to be proactive about stemming the tide of those orphan works, and the local context tools are a fantastic way to do that. So thank you all for coming today, and a huge thank you to the local context team for the work they do and for organising this webinar today.
Kia ora, Rose. Thank you. I'm just going to get Maui to close up for us with a karakia.
Kia koutou. Thanks everyone. Thanks for being said. Just final karakia, ki tau ki tātou katoa, te atawhao tō tātou arihi huparaiti, te aroha o te atua me te whiwhinga te tanga ki te wairua tapu ake āmene.
Kia ora.